Hello and welcome everyone, I'm Space Wizard Total War, and thanks so much for stopping by the second of our Guild Battle Tactics lessons. A series where I take two battle strategies throughout antiquity, and give a brief history on how it was used, and then show you how to adapt it to a faction in Warhammer. I'll give army compositions for early, mid, and late game, and unless we're discussing a DLC specific faction like the Ogres, we'll have the main guide be on the base units that the faction has access to with no DLC. I'll have any upgrades those pieces of content might bring to your armies in as a side note. This episode is going to be structured a little bit differently from the first because Nurgle handles buildings very differently from other factions. It'll be going over the strengths and weaknesses the faction has to work with and overcome before breaking down army composition. Before we dive in, please remember to leave a like for Light God and a sub for the Sub Throne. It really helps me out. Also, let me know in the comments how you might modify the tactics you're about to see. How would you upgrade the guild strategy? Or would you use a different formation altogether? I'd love to hear from you all. Lastly, this is going to be a campaign battle guide geared mainly towards new players, but I do hope any veterans can learn something or at least have fun watching. Grandfather Nurgle. Plague, pox, ague, disease, death, and rampant virulent cancerous life. These will be at your command when leading the Father's forces. The problem with unleashing all that power is going to come in a couple forms. Nurgle's struggles in a few places we'll need to keep in mind. Firstly, and most obviously, being the overall speed of units. The roster has actually had its speed boosted a few times over the past many updates, so it no longer feels like actually watching mold creep, but you're still always only as fast as your slowest unit when trying to maintain a formation, which makes your 27 speed Plague Bearers feel pretty sluggish. Warriors of Chaos and Thrones of Decay bring in a few faster units, and base Nurgle has the Rotflies and Furies, but lack of mobility is going to need to be taken note of when on the field. The second struggle is in overall damage output. While Grandfather does boast a few heavy hitters, the main bulk of your army is meant to hold and grind your enemies slowly down into paste. High defense, high physical resistance, and hefty health pools are what you're going to be working with to counter this lack of damage. Nurgle also has a bunch of debuff passive abilities scattered amongst the specialized troops that help you wear down your enemies further. You can only apply a debuff to a unit once, so if you bring multiple beasts to Nurgle, their slime trail won't stack multiple times. Late game, my armies with Nurgle tend to be much more elite toolboxes, with tons of units that can apply debuffs waiting in the wings to smash on in. With these upsides and downsides in mind, we actually want to form up our Nurgle armies as just big blobs, surrounding our healers and leadership boosters, which most people already do. This strategy, though, I find just as boring as the blue horror spam over with Zeech, so we'll try to spice things up a bit here. The two formations we'll be covering today are going to be the Rotten Core, Nurgle's variant of the Weakened Core utilized at the Battle of Marathon, and the Oozing Order, our version of Frederick the Great's favored battle strategy. As with all demon factions, leadership is even more important than health, so we'll always want at least 2 or even 3 heroes spread across any formation to keep your cohesion. Let's get started with my go-to strategy for facing off against melee-focused factions as Nurgle, the Rotten Core. Now, as previously stated, this is my own version of the strategy used by Athens at the Battle of Marathon. A Persian army of around 30 to 40,000 outnumbered the Athenian force nearly 3 to 1. Help was on the way from Sparta and the other Greek city-states, but would not arrive in time to help out in the main battle. The Athenian commander, Miltiades, devised an ingenious plan to make his army seem even larger and more imposing than it actually was, while simultaneously dealing strategic blows to the flanks of the Persian forces, by drawing men from his center line and using them to reinforce his flanks. They also met the Persian army at a running charge, which definitely caused confusion as melees were not usually started by a great charge as we often see in movies. The weakened Greek center did eventually break, and the Persian middle broke ranks to give chase. At the same time, the Athenian flanks overpowered their rivals and were able to then turn and crush the disorganized center, sending the Persians fleeing all the way back to their boats. Now, when discussing our Nurgle armies for this episode, I'm going to consider early game as a unit up to tier 2 on their unit card. Mid game will push that to tier 3, with late game incorporating the entire roster. The Father's military buildings on campaign are a bit different, where they'll be cycling to a new form every few turns, and depositing a couple units into a kind of mercenary recruitment pool. The later stages of these buildings is where your elite troops will come from, meaning you can definitely have more elites in your early to mid game than other factions, affording their upkeep is going to be your main issue though. This being said, your legendary lord options for Nurgle are all very powerful, with Kugath and Epidemius caring much more about demonic units, and Tomergon being properly insane. So much so, we're not actually going to be including him in this episode. The Maggot host's army compositions have so many variables due to how large Tomergon's roster is, that you can utilize pretty much any strategy across the entirety of this series with any myriad combinations of chieftain units. That means we're going to be looking at Kugath as the best Nurgle lord for any new players to start with, as he is himself an incredibly powerful melee and ranged fighter, with an extremely chunky health pool, and the full suite of spells from the lore of Nurgle. So we'll start with his base army as our foundation. You'll also want to keep in mind that all demonic units in Nurgle's roster will have high health pools, will cause fear, have poison and magical attacks, 20% physical resistance, and the Cloud of Flies passive, which is going to increase their melee defense by 9 after being in combat for 15 seconds. Kugath's first army is going to include Pox Santa himself, a Plague-ridden of Nurgle, which is a demonic spellcaster with low armor, 20% physical resistance, armor-piercing damage, better melee stats than Imperial Battle Mages, and specializing in either the Lore of Death or Nurgle magic. You'll have 3 Nurglings, which are your expendable demonic frontline that have a stat line very similar to Empire Swordsman, 2 Plague Bearers, which are Nurgle's main demonic frontline, with an extremely high health pool of 11,600 and a chunky 48 weapon strength being their main draws. You've got 1 unit of Plague Toads, a slow, heavy unit of War Beasts best utilized as shock flanking troops that have high armor-piercing damage, and 7 bonus for infantry to help them snack on plenty of man-witches. 1 unit of Plague Drones wielding Death's Head grenades, your premier flying monstrous cavalry packing powerful, short-range missile attacks. They're armor-piercing, magical, and poisonous. When they run out of ammo, they become a fairly quick shock unit with high mass, good for spinning squishier units in place for the kill. Nurgle Chaos Furies are the last unit you're given, which are a very fast, expendable flying demonic infantry. Very good at ripping apart missiles, artillery, and squishier single entities. A flying glass cannon mainly for disruption. Don't underestimate, though, how strong it is to have a unit or 2 on your side with an actual speed. Our final early game army will have Kugath, the Plague-ridden, a cultist of Nurgle, which is going to be a support hero with high melee attack that'll sunder enemy armor, dropping it by 30. Later on in their skill tree, they're also going to be able to summon Plague Bearers and a Great Unclean One, as well as have the option to be mounted on the Chaos Shrine of Nurgle if you have the Warriors of Chaos DLC. We'll have 1 Beast of Nurgle we'll grab from our summon pool, and I'll briefly take a moment to mention just how powerful Beasts of Nurgle are. Just imagine a Bastillodon's tankiness, add regeneration, immunity to flanking penalties, and the Slime Trail passive, which drops melee attack by 5 and speed by 10% for any in 15 meter radius. These are going to be the ultimate anvil for your forces. You'll have 4 units of Nurglings, 4 units of Plague Bearers, 4 Plague Toads, 2 Furies of Nurgle, your Death's Head Plague Drones, and then 1 normal Rotfly, which is going to perform slightly worse in melee than your normal Plague Drone, but functionally does the same thing. Once you've claimed the Lizard Stronghold, directly adjacent to Kugath's starting position, you'll then open up your summonable units to see just about the remainder of what this army needs. All you'll need to build to complete our formation is the Demonic Egg Sac basic military building. Tier 1 gives us our extra Furies, and once it cycles to Tier 2, which takes about 5 turns base, you'll be granted 2 more Plague Toads. 1 more cycle in and you'll have the Rotflies. Your Cultist is going to come from your base level walls, and the Plague Bearers you'll already have in your summon pool, but more can be gained through the Plague Flesh Poppies line. When deploying your army, grab their Plague Bearers and Nurglings, and deploy them in a line with the Plague Bearers on the flanks, and Nurglings acting as your Rotten Core. I place the rest of the Nurglings in front of the Plague Bearers to act as a missile and blade soak. They'll retreat behind our Plague Bearers when they start to falter, and find a flank to bite into. We'll deploy our Toads in the back, protect our flanks, and act as the horrible oozing surprise in the rotten center. You'll then deploy the Beast of Nurgle and Kugath on one flank, and the 2 heroes on the other. You functionally are going to be controlling 2 independent blobs that will slowly crush the life out of your foes. As the battle begins, your strategy will unfold like this. Your line is going to crash into the opposing force, or you'll take the best defensive zone possible and wait for them to come to you. Once the melee begins, you'll keep your outermost toes looking for enemy cavalry to duel, and half of your flyers will be in charge of helping on either side. Your center line, you'll immediately start to retreat behind your main line, and give your innermost toads, the Beast of Nurgle, and one of those heroes the charge order to break those now pursuing enemy troopers. Turn your Nurglings back around to join the fray, and suddenly those triumphant enemy units find themselves overwhelmed and destroyed by crushing numbers and flanking charges. With the enemy center now shattered, you can turn your own center to annihilating the enemy flanks, finishing the fight. This formation's weakness is going to be overwhelming amounts of artillery and spell damage, or anti-large options that can deal with your toads. Honestly, no formation is going to fare well against spells and artillery, which is part of the reason the death toll was so high, especially in the First World War. Both sides were initially attempting to fight using group infantry battalions and organized cavalry charges, which were easily destroyed by powerful artillery and firearms that had been developed, to extremely horrific effect. Nurgle is also never going to like dealing with any amounts of fire or lots of missiles, as the units rely heavily on healing, which is cut in half by fire damage, and a Cloud of Flies passive that grants your units +9 melee defense does nothing to protect your low-armored demons from small arms fire. Always build your armies with answers to the specific faction you're battling, and you'll have a much better time. Now on to DLC swap-outs. When talking Warriors of Chaos, you're getting 2 of each Nurgle Marauder, Chaos Warriors, and Chosen, wielding either Hand Axe and Shield for frontline fighting, or Great Axe for that armor-piercing punch. There's nothing in this DLC that you actually need to improve the formation, but I do like replacing one or both of these frontline Nurglings with Great Weapon Marauders, and then Chaos Warriors when I can afford them, or Exalted Heroes of Nurgle for a bit more damage. If you want to go the mortal route, you can completely replace the demons in your front line, and have all the Nurglings swap over to Chaos Warriors with Great Weapons. And those who prefer Chaos Chariots to Plague Toads might replace the 2 Sneak Attack Toads with Chariots for a bit more variance. Thrones of Decay is only going to have a single unit in Tier 2, but I absolutely love the Pestigores. These bad goat boys are going to be packing in armor-piercing Great Axes, low armor, and 2 pretty decent passives, Primal Fury and the Tears of Nurgle. First of which is a basic Beastmen passive that boosts attack, charge bonus, speed, and grants immunity to psychology as long as their leadership is higher than 50%. And the second is a single-use debuff that will slow an enemy and drain their stamina if their own leadership begins to waver or they break. In this formation, they work very well replacing those frontal Nurglings or even your centerline Nurglings. Their armor piercing and speed allowing them to be much more maneuverable and hit way harder. Mid-game is probably my favorite version of this formation, and we'll be replacing all of our normal Plague Bearers with their exalted counterparts. These guys will be a strict upgrade on the normal Plague Bearers, with increased stats and 3 Death's Head grenades to chuck into an oncoming crowd, dealing 38 magical armor-piercing damage each toss. Our Rotten Core is going to be replaced by 2 units of Spawn, or alternatively, you can use 2 more Beasts of Nurgle if you don't like using Spawn, but they are unbreakable, high-damage monsters infantry with poison attacks. Find an unbreakable Nurgle unit you can heal to be a fantastic retreatable unit, Spring our Rotten Trap. We'll have 4 Pox Riders of Nurgle. Like the Exalted Plague Bearers, these are basically strict upgrades on the non-Rider variant, with nothing too exciting really to speak of. They are Exalted Plague Bearers riding big chunky toads, what's not to love? We'll have 2 Beasts of Nurgle this time, 1 for each flank, 2 Plague Drones of Nurgle, and the one with the Death's Head grenade you start the campaign with, 2 Cultists, and the Plague-ridden and Papa Kugath himself. Your DLC swap-ins for Warriors of Chaos are going to be Chosen of Nurgle if you prefer them to Plague Bearers, but that's really it. I'm adding this in as a post-edit, but your Cultists of Nurgle will be mountable on Chaos War Shrines of Nurgle, which grants healing and leadership to all in a 35-meter radius. There's no reason to take the normal War Shrine unless you're at your limit on Cultists. As far as Thrones of Decay goes, though, I'm going to be replacing 2 of my Pox Riders with Bile Trolls, for all the normal reasons you'd want to bring Trolls, plus higher stats across the board, but 5 less melee attack, and the Corrosive Bile passive, which drops all opposing melee defense by 6 in a 35-meter radius, making for an excellent support flank. We'll also replace the other 2 Pox Riders with Plague Ogres with great weapons. Nurgle had no real anti-large of any kind before the Thrones DLC. That is a tool we'll be making use of as soon as possible in our formations. When now in upgrading this formation to its final form, the foundations remain fundamentally the same with Kugath. Our Plague-ridden, now mounted on a Rotfly, our 2 Cultists that I tend to keep on foot, 2 Beasts of Nurgle, 4 Exalted Plague Bearers, now 4 Plague Drones rocking Death's Heads, maintain aerial superiority, 2 Pox Riders, and now adding 2 Soul Grinders of Nurgle, which are a hybrid artillery and melee single entity, that fires armor-piercing Plague Blasts and 3-round bursts that devastate enemy infantry formations. Finally, we'll add 2 Great Unclean Ones, Nurgle's Greater Demons and pure Paragons of Filth and Decay. These big chunky bad boys absolutely beat the brakes off of most anything you throw them at, and they come with 2 basic Lore of Nurgle bounce spells. You'll gain even more through specific research nodes as well. Keeping your Pox Riders or any other unit that has a bit more charge bonus is also acceptable, as you do want that trap to deal as much damage on the initial punch as possible. Warriors of Chaos upgrades this time are going to be incredibly simple, as I'd probably just swap in 2 Chosen with Great Weapons for the Exalted Plague Bearers. You just have a blended line of the 2. Your Cultists will also be able to be mounted on a War Shrine, which will make a huge difference in each flank's survivability. Your Thrones of Decay will drop in 2 great big Toad Dragons, and proceed to watch them feast. Huge melee stats, good speed, good armor, terror, and the unspeakable foulness breath attack make for a big green beat stick you'll always enjoy watching go to work. We'll also sub out our Pox Riders for Rot Knights, for Nurgle's premier anti-everything cavalry. Faster and meaner with the ability to regenerate, and a hefty bonus versus large, these guys make an instant pick when upgrading. But that is going to be all for our Rotten Core. Our variant and reimagining of the weakened center tactic to fit you. I'm curious though how you might upgrade this formation, change the lineup, or perhaps reimagine the weakened center in your own way. Below the comments. Next will be the Oozing Order, Nurgle's version of the Oblique Order, a formation that has been utilized in many famous battles from Frederick the Great of Prussia to the Battle of Luttra, where the Theban army was able to defeat a supposedly superior Spartan force. The idea is to deploy your forces in such a way that one flank is incredibly strong and possesses your most elite shock troops, and your remaining forces deploy in a line away from them. Your strengthened flank will crash into their opposition, while your weakened line will attempt to avoid combat for as long as possible, and hold while the strengthened flank deals with their foes, and turns to crush the remaining enemies. This formation relies heavily on your weakened line's ability to hold, while that empowered flank does most of the slaying. You'll be weaker against artillery and spells, of course, and if your overpowering attack fails, you will outright lose the battle right then and there. Trying to keep that weakened line out of the fight for as long as possible without retreating too far away from your empowered flank is going to be key. For our early game army, we'll be building with Kugath's starting army and its summonable units as our foundation, and then crafting an army very similar to our Rotten Core. The list will be Pox Santa himself, our Nurgle Plague Ridden, 1 Cultist of Nurgle, 1 Plague Drone with Death's Heads, 2 Beasts of Nurgle, 4 Plague Bearers, 4 Nurglings, 4 Plague Toads, and 2 Furies of Nurgle to control those skies. With their boost to leadership in the recent patch, I tend to run Furies over Rotflies because they seem to trade better against other flying units, kill archers way faster, which is the main reasons I run them. I'll go over DLC swap-ins now, where for Warriors of Chaos, I'd remove the Nurglings in place for 4 Marauders, later Chaos Warriors with great weapons. Plague Bearers would now be my holding line, while the armor-piercing warriors act as the power flank. Thrones of Decay, Pestigores are incredible at keeping up with your Plague Toads, and deliver a nasty punch when they actually hit the enemy. And to make a very blended line and run 2 Warriors with Great Axes and 2 Pestigores behind them. When deploying your Oozing Order, we're going to first grab Kugath or whichever lord you're running, and 1 of the 2 Beasts of Nurgle, and place them on your left flank. Directly behind them, we'll deploy 2 Plague Bearer units, and 2 more right behind that unit. Finish our Oozing flank off, 2 Plague Toads behind our Plague Bearer stack. We'll get our extra Toads deployed on the flanks, and the Nurglings will deploy in a straight line, slightly offset between the first and second ranks of your power flank. Your Hero and Plague Ridden will be deployed along the Nurgling line to keep their leadership up, and the Beast will join whichever of your heroes you choose to deploy closer to the Oozing flank. Nice and simple. You can deploy on campaign against the AI just like this without worrying about them countering, but definitely move your units into formation as you close the gap on your foes of playing on multiplayer to not give away your strategy too soon. Now, talking upgrades, your Nurgle armies are going to start getting incredibly durable very fast. In the mid-game, I'd replace all of our Nurglings and 2 of our Plague Bearers with Exalted Plague Bearers. They're horrifying hoplites of Nurgle's faction. 2 Spawn of Nurgle will replace the last of the 2 normal Plague Bearers on the front of our Oozing flank. 4 Pox Riders, which are strict upgrades on the Plague Toads, now take their place, and we'll replace our Furies with Plague Drones for some proper armor-piercing flyers. When talking DLC, for Warriors of Chaos, you want your Cultist Nurgle mounted on his War Shrine for chunky heals and a big smashy unit, while Chosen with Great Axes will take the place of 2 Exalted Plague Bearers. You can swap in Chaos Knights for your Pox Riders if you wish, but I tend to keep the demonic Hoppy Boys out of pure preference. For Thrones of Decay, I'm just going to swap one of my Oozing flank spawn with a single Bile Troll, so we can drop enemy melee defense and hopefully roll that flank even faster. Add 3 Plague Ogres in place of the Spawn and Pox Riders, and 2 Great Weapon Plague Ogres to replace your flanking cavalry. You got yourself one scary formation. Now, as I'll say again and again, the late game armies are mostly going to come down to your own favorite elite units, and finding the positions in this formation that make the most sense. But I settled on this list. 2 Geth, or Plague Ridden, 1 Cultist, 3 Death's Heads Plague Drones, 2 Soul Grinders of Nurgle, 5 Exalted Plague Bearers, 1 Big Chunky Great Unclean One, 2 Spawn, 2 Beasts of Nurgle, and 2 Pox Riders. To be even more nasty, you can replace that 5th Plague Bearer with a 3rd Soul Grinder and watch your foes weep. For your DLC swap-ins, Warrior doesn't really bring any excitement that really makes you want to swap in units. If you really like the Chaos Knights with Lances, go ahead and swap them in for your Pox Riders. Thrones of Decay is going to be where the true spiciness lies. Replace your Pox Riders with the Rot Knights, Spawn for your Plague Ogres of either variant, and the Great Unclean One for the far superior Toad Dragon. This formation is surprisingly powerful even facing missile and hybrid armies due to that concentration of power all on one flank. That is our Oozing order. Once again, please let me know in the comments how you'd improve on the guild strategy or just what units you might swap in instead. I'd love to hear from you. That's going to be all for this video. Thank you all so much for stopping by our guild tactics lesson on Nurgle, the Oblique Order, and the Weakened Center. Our next guide will be either focused on Khorne or Slaanesh. Do let me know what you'd like to see next down in the comments as well. If you enjoyed the video, remember to leave a like for the Light God and a sub for the Sub Throne, and I'll see you all next one.